Thank you, Rachel. So what we're going to talk about today is for the trifecta. You have tariffs, PFAS, and Prop 65, all very important to the travel goods industry, all things that you should probably know about, and how you approach your business going forward. Okay, so the agenda for today, just going to give you a little overview of the US travel goods industry. Most of you are living and breathing this, so, but you're in your own little corner, so I'm just going to give an overall view of the industry, what's happening with trade policy and tariffs, and then my colleague Conor is going to talk about PFAS and Prop 65. And then we'll leave plenty of time for questions so that you guys can ask us anything you want. Okay, so the US travel goods market today. 97% of all travel goods sold in the United States are imported. But obviously we employ tens of thousands of people in the United States in the jobs that you guys do, the people who design and market all of the travel goods, the people who work on compliance issues with travel goods. We employ a lot of Americans, even though we don't manufacture the luggage, the backpacks, the accessories here in the United States. So a couple of facts that you might not know about. We are the highest tariff industry in the United States. Even though we don't make anything here, we are the highest tariff industry. So compared with overall imports, the tariffs on travel goods are 6 times larger than the average tariff on all US imports. And if you combine travel goods with clothes and shoes, they make up only 5% by value of total US imports. But in 2024, accounted for over 25% of all tariffs collected on imports. Now that is in 2024, before all the new tariffs came into effect. So those numbers are just gonna get worse. Okay, so as you know, the average duty right now on most travel goods are 17.6 or 20%, depending if it's fabric or if it's hard side or plastic. But when you're importing from China now, those tariffs now today are 62.5% to 65%. So you're talking about more than half the value of the luggage or the other accessories you're bringing in is you have to pay in tariffs. So where are we getting these travel goods from? China is still by far the #1 supplier of travel goods to the United States. We're talking about almost half of all US travel goods coming to the United States come from one country, China. Now, that might seem really bad that we're so dependent on one country, but look where we were less than 10 years ago. We were talking about 85% of all travel goods came from China. So we're still overly relying on China, but we've moved a little bit away at least. But we're also highly concentrated in just a few suppliers. So you're talking about the top 5 suppliers supply 90% of all travel goods sold in the United States. So we're still highly concentrated because travel goods are hard to make, as you know. And you guys have been searching for over a decade to try and find new suppliers of travel goods, and travel goods are hard to make. Not many countries have the capacity or the capability to do it. And so this is what we're running into as we're trying to move away from China. So who are the top suppliers of travel goods? So this is a list of the top 12 suppliers. So China, obviously, Vietnam, and Vietnam has been growing by double digits practically every year for probably about 20 years in our industry. Cambodia is now the #3 supplier of travel goods to the US market. This has happened literally just since the beginning of COVID. They've had meteoric growth over the last few years, but they supply, even with that meteoric growth, they still supply only 11% of all US travel goods imports. And then the numbers drop precipitously from there. India, Myanmar, you have new countries like Bangladesh coming in, and even though they had a 92.1% increase in 2024, they're still less than 1% of total imports. Okay, so now let's get to the fun part. all the tariffs from President Trump. So in the 60+ days he's been in office, he has imposed a range of new tariffs on imports. So first, the one that all of you are most familiar with is the 20% tariff on US imports from China. This does not just apply to travel goods, it applies to all imports from China. China is not just the biggest supplier of travel goods, it's the biggest supplier of many products for the US market. And of course, as you know, as I described already, that 20% is on top of the normal 17.6 to 20%, on top of the 25% Section 301 tariffs President Trump imposed in his first term. And so you're talking 62.5% to 65% tariffs total. President Trump also imposed 25% tariffs on US imports from Mexico and Canada. While Mexico is not a major supplier to the US market, it is a top 10 supplier of travel goods, but it's been declining for many years. So we've also seen 25% tariffs on all US aluminum and steel imports. Again, not a direct impact on us, although some of the materials we use are derived from aluminum and steel, so anything that drives up the cost of the basic inputs into some of the zippers and buttons and other things that we use are going to drive up our costs. But this also drives retaliation. So Europe has retaliated against US-made products, and those include US-made travel goods. Again, there's not much, but there are some US-made travel goods, and their biggest export market is Europe, and now they face 25% tariffs going into Europe. So President Trump just announced this week that on April 2nd, he's going to impose 25% tariffs on all US imports from countries that use Venezuelan oil. Now, this is the first time any sort of tariff has been designed like this, where it's what we call a secondary tariff. But why this matters is we believe one of the countries that's a major buyer of Venezuelan oil is India. India is a major supplier of travel goods to the US. So President Trump has also proposed reciprocal tariffs. Many of you have heard about this. He talks about making the playing field leveling the playing field, making it fair and reciprocal. What is the point of these reciprocal tariffs? It's to say that other countries are charging higher tariffs on US-made products than we're charging on their products. And therefore, we need to level the playing field. Or they're charging huge value-added taxes or VAT taxes on imports while we're not doing that. Completely disregarding the fact that we have sales taxes in every state, and some of those sales taxes are as high as those VAT taxes, which I'll show in a moment. Or we have huge trade deficits with these countries, which means somehow they're hurting us, and somehow they're doing something wrong. Or they impose huge non-tariff barriers on our products, so even if they have 5% duties on US-made automobiles, there's all these other rules that make it impossible to sell a car, an American-made car, in a country. Example of that would be India, where it's, even though their tariffs are not that high, the other rules make it next to impossible to sell an American car there. So let's look at some of the data that, that President Trump might be using to determine what tariffs he will impose on April 2nd. So what are the countries we need to worry about here? Vietnam, the third largest trade deficit with the United States. Obviously, the second largest supplier of our product. Over 20% of travel goods sold in the United States come from Vietnam. What's another country on here that you probably need to look at? India would be another one to look at here. So these are countries to worry about for trade deficits. But let's look at the average tariffs here. So these average tariffs on our main suppliers of travel goods as well as clothes and shoes. The tariffs that the US charges on products from these countries, in most cases, are significantly higher than the tariffs they charge on US products. That's true in the case of China, true in the case of Vietnam, true in the case of Cambodia, true in the case of Indonesia, true in the case of Bangladesh, again, which is an up-and-coming supplier. The only place that's really not true for our industry, again, is India. So much for this theory that, well, everybody's charging us higher tariffs. Why is that? Because most of the products we get from some of these countries are travel goods, clothes, shoes, which have the highest tariffs in the United States. So, I mean, look at Bangladesh, for example. That's because all they supply to the United States are clothes, shoes, and travel goods, which have the highest tariffs of anything coming into the US. Okay, so again, I mentioned VAT taxes. So let's compare the VAT taxes versus US sales taxes in various states. And these are both Republican states and Democratic states. So you can see that in many cases, except for a place like India, where the sales taxes are roughly equivalent to the VAT taxes. And just to note, the VAT taxes in every country are charged on all products sold in that country. It's not something specific for imports coming into that country. Okay, so what are the next steps? So this was a quote from the US Trade Representative. You've been hearing a lot of references by the Treasury Secretary and the National Economic Advisor about the Dirty 15. It's been very hard to get a list of who is the Dirty 15, but this is the list I've been able to find. So I put in bold the major suppliers of travel goods to the US, but I don't think the list is limited to this list. There's been a lot of attacks on Indonesia, and so I wouldn't be surprised if something happens to Indonesia. But at this point, we have no idea if it's limited to the top 15 countries, the top 50 countries, 5 countries, 2 countries. We have no idea what's going to happen. But something is going to happen on April 2nd, so 1 week from today. And so it's regrettable, I'm not talking after this. Everything I could say has been thrown out the window come April 2nd, but a lot could happen. So with that, I'm going to completely change gears and turn it to my colleague Conor to talk about 2 other items that you really need to be knowing about and paying attention to.
Thanks so much, Nate. All right. All right. Can you all hear me? Amazing. So good morning, everyone. My name is Conor O'Brien, and I am the Sustainability Policy Coordinator for the American Apparel and Footwear Association. And this morning, I'm going to be talking to you all about everyone's favorite early morning topic, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, otherwise known as PFAS. So for those fortunate few in the room who are not yet intimately familiar with what PFAS are, they are a class of chemicals that number almost 15,000 that started to gain prevalence in the 1950s that are sort of typified by that chained carbon-fluorine structure. So PFAS are really, really good at preventing things from sticking. And so that's to do with those strong carbon-fluorine bonds. And so when you think of water resistance or oil resistance or stain resistance, so what you're thinking of is PFAS. So when you think about a nonstick pan or a stain-resistant fabric, generally speaking, what you're thinking about is PFAS. Now, because of those really strong chained carbon-fluorine atoms, PFAS are really very stable, and so they don't break down very easily. We often think about PFAS as being forever chemicals. This is not necessarily a bad thing, so when you're thinking about something like firefighting, personal protective equipment, you really want that to last. You want them to be able to do their firefighting missions and not worry that the material that's on their personal protective equipment is going to evaporate. However, it is problematic for a number of other goods, given that PFAS have been linked to various negative health effects. And so the bioaccumulation of PFAS in the environment has been linked to cancer and to a lower immune system capacity. And so over the last number of years, we've seen a real uptick in PFAS regulation. So kind of from a toxicological point of view, the main routes of exposure for PFAS are, generally speaking, ingestion, so consuming something that has been contaminated by PFAS, food, water, etc., or inhalation, so breathing in air that's saturated with PFAS. The sort of route of exposure for our industry, dermal exposure, so touching something, is a relatively lower risk route of exposure. However, we have seen a real uptick in regulations for our industry in particular. So in the US, action on the federal level has been pretty slow, which I know will come as a shocker to you all. And so as a result, several states have taken matters into their own hands, typically Democratic states, and have started regulating PFAS themselves. Unfortunately, as is often the case with a sort of a state landscape of regulation, when there's not a federal threshold or a federal floor, you get somewhat of a piecemeal approach to PFAS regulation, with each state deciding their own flavor of what exactly is PFAS, how you can use it, how you can dispose of it, what timelines are appropriate for phasing out PFAS, etc. And so I don't want to go over each state's approach to PFAS. That would take much longer than this session is allotted for. However, I will put a plug in for any AAFA members in the audience that we do have a PFAS regulation tracker that we are currently updating that will go into each state in more detail. So what I will be doing is speaking to a few sort of salient textile restrictions currently in effect, as well as a currently pending piece of legislation. So to kick things off with California, from January of this year, they prohibited intentionally added PFAS in most textile articles, which does include things like backpacks and the like, with a total organic fluorine limit of 100 parts per million. So these TOF limits are not necessarily a perfect indicator for presence of PFAS. You know, they pick up things like naturally occurring total organic fluorine, but they're like a really common proxy that you'll see as a way of testing for PFAS, just because there are so many different kinds of PFAS, almost 15,000, and so testing for each individual one is really, really hard. In California, from 2027 onwards, that restriction will constrict to 50 parts per million, and it's also important to note that in California, the restriction applies not just to the whole product, but to product components. So things like zippers are within scope of California's PFAS restriction. Moving on to New York. New York's ban is pretty similar to the Californian ban. However, it targets just apparel to the exclusion of footwear and bags and the like. The key difference in terms of the way they actually implement this ban is that they don't have a total organic fluorine limit. However, the way the bill is written, it does instruct the New York DEC to come up with such a limit in 2027. There is also currently pending legislation that was introduced last year and reintroduced this year in New York that would widen the scope of the restriction beyond apparel to include footwear, bags, and other textile goods. Moving on to Minnesota. Minnesota's PFAS restriction essentially came about after a woman called Amara Strand died of a rare form of cancer while she was actively campaigning for a PFAS pollution prevention bill. And so Amara's law, as it became to be known, it essentially looks at a phased introduction of PFAS restrictions. It also requires the ongoing reporting of PFAS-containing products, including a variety of textile goods. So as things currently stand in Minnesota, juvenile products are within scope. So think things like booster seats. That is currently in scope, and you're not allowed to have booster seats that would contain PFAS. And then by 2032, all consumer goods will be rolled into it. So all travel goods in Minnesota by 2032 covered under Amara's law. It's also worth noting that next year, the law will require reporting across all consumer goods that contain PFAS at the CAS number level, which is awfully tricky because, again, there are almost 15,000 different PFAS chemistries, and so we're going to see what that reporting ends up looking like. Just to quickly provide an overview of some pending legislation in Washington after a pretty lengthy study by Washington's Department of Ecology in which they examined the current uses of PFAS and the availability of alternatives. They recommended several reporting requirements across textile goods, so outdoor apparel, footwear, and more importantly for this group, gear for recreation and travel, which will kick in 2026 if it goes as proposed. And they also recommended an apparel-wide ban on PFAS from 2027. So after they put out these recommendations as part of their cycle 1.5, they put it out to public comment. AAFA submitted our own comments on what we thought about the way they defined intentionally added PFAS, the deadlines, the need for our industry to include things like sell-through provisions so that you can sell goods that you've already manufactured that contained PFAS. And so we're currently in sort of a waiting pattern to see what happens in Washington. Moving on to the federal side of things, as I alluded to earlier, there have been relatively few restrictions on the actual use of PFAS, but what has happened is a one-time reporting requirement under TSCA. So unlike more typical EPA reporting requirements, this is pretty lengthy, right? It looks at all goods from 2011 right through to the end of 2022, manufactured or imported that contain PFAS. And this is kind of with the view of EPA developing a comprehensive and a public database of current PFAS uses, their status, what sort of alternatives have been floated, and what is ultimately done to dispose of this. Now, obviously, the EPA has undergone a couple of changes over the last few months. Under the current administrator, Lee Zeldin, they've definitely veered more towards deregulation. But our assumption for the nonce is that this reporting will go ahead as planned, given that it was through a congressional mandate. And so the window currently is open from July 11th through to January 4th of next year. It is worth noting that they had previously extended this reporting window under the last administration. And with EPA increasingly losing funding, it could well be the case that this reporting window extends again. But for right now, assume that these are the relevant dates. So as a general rule, the PFAS reporting requirement applies to any persons who have manufactured for commercial purposes products containing PFAS from 2011 through to 2022, in which they do include import. There are a couple of streamlined reporting sort of forms that you can avail yourself of if you fall into that category. And so for manufacturers and importers, if that's straight what you are, you're out of luck. You have to use the general reporting form. However, if you are a manufacturer or importer for research and development in particular, you can avail yourself of the R&D reporting form. And then if you're an article importer, an importer of articles in particular, you can avail yourself of the article importer form, and then small article importers get a longer reporting window. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but again, plug for any AAFA members in the audience, we have a co-branded guidance on the TSCA reporting that we put out with Martin Law that goes into all of this in more detail. So certain PFAS uses are exempted from reporting. PFAS produced for pesticides, food additives, drugs, cosmetics, medical devices, all excluded from reporting, as are waste processors for disposal. As you are engaging with this reporting that's due by January of next year, it is possible to say, hey, we made this product in 2013. There is no way that we could feasibly know that it contained PFAS through listing it as not known or reasonably ascertained. However, you do need to be able to back that up. You know, you can't just look at the whole reporting window and shrug your shoulders and say, hey, I don't know. EPA does expect that you will perform adequate due diligence and gather all of the information in your control or that you could feasibly be expected to gain. So EPA is not expecting you to perform any new testing, but they do expect that you'll contact relevant product suppliers to get information on any products that could reasonably be expected to have had a PFAS coating. So for example, something like a water-resistant duffel bag, you could reasonably anticipate that this would have had a PFAS treatment in 2013, and so it would be appropriate to reach out to the suppliers and manufacturers of such a product. And then if after reaching out to all of your suppliers, going through old manufacturing logs, you still don't know how much PFAS was in the product, but you know that there would have been PFAS, you are able to provide reasonable estimates of how much PFAS would have been in that product. So once you've gathered all of this information, you will need to report out your company and site information, all of the relevant chemical type information, how and how much you used those chemicals, what were any likely byproducts, whether you anticipate any environmental and health outcomes from your use of PFAS, what worker exposure looked like to PFAS throughout the reporting window, and what you ultimately did to dispose of products containing PFAS. As with all things EPA, there are, of course, penalties for not complying with this, which grow more serious if you try to obfuscate and not give to EPA the information that you should otherwise have given to EPA. Looking to our neighbors in the north, in Canada, they also introduced a similar PFAS reporting requirement midway through last year, which was due this past January. The Canadian PFAS reporting requirement was slightly different. It looked at just about 300 specific PFAS chemicals that were manufactured or imported into Canada in calendar year 2023, which annoyingly did not overlap with EPA's TSCA reporting requirement. Also worth noting in Canada is that just this month, the Ministers of Health and Environment made the recommendation based on Canada's chemical management plan for a national ban on PFAS in consumer products, which is going to be done through a phased prohibition. As of right now, we're in a public comment period, which extends through to May, after which they'll enter into phase 1, which will have its own comment period. And so if it's going ahead as planned, we could see a ban on PFAS in Canada for textile products, so including travel goods, by around 2029, but things will clarify more as they go through their public comment period. Lastly, on PFAS regulation, I do want to point out that the EU has been proposing a union-wide ban for the last number of years, which has yet to materialize. And so what I will point out is the restriction of PFHXA, which is a PFAS chemical commonly used in stain-resistant fabrics, that went on to REACH, which is the sort of EU chemical restriction compendium, late last year, and that will go into effect in July of 2027, so 18 months from when it was added to REACH. And then, although there is no EU-wide ban, both France and Denmark have proposed bans for PFAS restrictions in textiles. France's ban looks at apparel from 2026 and then expands out to all other textile products in 2030, whereas Denmark concentrates on just apparel to the exclusion of other products, and they use one of those TOF limits, so 50 parts per million. Sidestepping a little bit into lawsuits, everyone's favorite topic of discussion, I do want to talk a little bit about the lawsuit landscape. So there have been a number of pretty high-profile PFAS lawsuits over the last while, and these suits tend to fall into one of two buckets. The first of which is for essentially misleading claims about your products, and the second is for some actual harm from a specific PFAS chemical. The latter of those so actual harm from a specific PFAS chemical is much harder to prove because there are so many different PFAS chemicals. We don't really understand each of their effects on health, and actually linking a health output to a specific PFAS chemical is really hard to do. And so what has been getting more traction is sort of green claims. So saying my product is PFAS-free or uses sustainable materials, because that's a much easier argument to make, right? It's easier to say that a consumer might feasibly have paid more for a product that used quote-unquote sustainable materials, or might feasibly not have bought a product if they had known that it contained PFAS. Which leads me to a very general bit of advice is please don't claim that your products are PFAS-free, even if you've reformulated your products such that they don't have any intentionally added PFAS. The prevalence of the chemical in the environment is such that it's a bad idea. Contamination is rife. Closing things out with Prop 65, without going into over many details because I know you all live and breathe Prop 65. It is essentially a chemical exposure notification law, which means, generally speaking, any amount of one of the over 900 listed Prop 65 chemicals in your products can lead to a 60-day notice if found by one of the Prop 65 bounty hunters, which can then lead to litigation and to you all being very sad at work. And so given how expansive this list has grown over the last while, it is AAFA's recommendation that you use a warning label as the only way to indemnify yourself from Prop 65. If you do decide on using a label, you have the option of using either the long or short form labels, which are depicted on the slides. The long form is a little more specific and cites particular chemicals, whereas the short form is more of a catch-all. In terms of where to actually put these labels, Prop 65 requires that it be near other consumer information before the time of purchase. And so for travel goods, we do recommend putting it near the price and product information, whether that be on a hang tag, or if you don't use a hang tag, by the sticker. I will also point out that BPA and BPS are both live on the Prop 65 list. Those restrictions are in effect, and vinyl acetate will happen in January of next year. And so as this list continues to grow, it's a good idea to consider whether or not you want to use these warning labels, because it really is the only way to indemnify yourself under Prop 65. And last, just in terms of developments, OEHA, towards the end of last year, has changed the structure of the short form warning label such that it will, from January 1, 2028, require that you cite a specific chemical on the Prop 65 list. And so we'll see what happens with that. That's about it for me. Please let me know if you have any further questions, and I'll invite Nate to join me back here.
Conor, could you just explain for me exactly, when you talk about PFAS and PFOA, so PFOA is one of the components of the PFAS structure or list?
Yeah, it's squares and rectangles. So PFAS is like the whole family, whereas PFOA is a particular kind of PFAS that it appears on the Prop 65 list and elsewhere.
Okay, so that it does appear on the Prop 65 list. So if my products are
PFOS and PFHXA.
Yeah.
So if my products are on the Prop 60, well, if my products I'm claiming that they're PFOA free, I should be looking to put this warning label to comply or to avert any problem with the Prop 65?
Well, so as I alluded to earlier, we generally don't recommend claiming that it's PFAS free. What you can do is say we haven't intentionally added any PFAS or PFOS or PFOA or whatever the case may be. If it's not showing up in testable amounts in your product, I don't think that.
The problem with Prop 65 is that if you have any trace of one of the 900 plus chemicals, you can be targeted with a 60-day notice and then litigated against and have to reach the settlement. And so the intentionally added or not intentionally added, when you're talking about PFOA, PFOS, or I can never pronounce the other one. Yeah, that even if you have a trace element, which there's a chance you'll have because, again, PFAS is endemic in the environment. It's in the water supply, so anything that you make that touches water is going to likely have some trace elements. You might be in violation. And again, this is why we recommend the warning label. It indemnifies you against everything, indemnifies your customers against everything. And so that's why we recommend the warning label, because that is the main difference between the PFAS laws in California, New York, and elsewhere, and Prop 65, is that there is no intentionally added versus not intentionally added. You have a trace element. They don't cover all of PFAS. They only cover the worst of the PFAS. But you could be targeted with Prop 65 notice.
Hi, good morning. You mentioned the bounty hunters on that. Are they actually going out and purchasing product and testing the product in the field?
Yes. Yeah. So we also put together for our membership a tracker of all of the Prop 65 notices, and you'll see about the same 10 names pop up over and over and over again. So yes, they're absolutely buying the product, sending it out to a lab, and then litigating.
Okay. So my understanding is that if you put the Prop 65 label on your product, on the tag or somewhere, they won't buy it. They will say, these are clear.
There would be no reason to, because you've already provided the notice, so yeah.
Got it. Thank you so much. Nate, by the way, the VAT in Mexico is 16%. I didn't see it on your list.
Yeah, I mean, because there are already tariffs in Mexico, so we figured this out. What will likely happen in Mexico and Canada on April 2nd is all the exemptions that I had on my slide that currently exist, most of those will go out the window. So if you qualify under the US Mexico-Canada agreement, right now you're technically exempted from the 25% tariff. That'll go away on April 2nd. So that's how he's going to get back at Mexico for their VAT other things, even though everything else is duty-free, so you don't have a tariff issue there. So.